Chapter 699 of One Piece, titled Morning Edition, was released in Weekly Shonen Jump on February 25th, 2013, bringing an end to the Punk Hazard arc, meaning it's been 10 years. I feel old, and that means it's time for a retrospective. Welcome back to Punk Hazard, 10 years later. One Piece fans have a strange relationship with the word foreshadowing, and by that I mean they misuse it all the time. They confuse it for dramatic irony, narrative setups and payoffs, and parallels both strong and flimsy. And this makes me appreciate Punk Hazard more as time goes on, because it is a proper example of a story arc being jam-packed with actual narrative setup, or as crazy people like to call everything, foreshadowing. I recently reread Punk Hazard and it's pretty good. I wouldn't call it underrated because it's still far from my favorite story arc, but I do think it's underappreciated. It's kind of astonishing how much happened in this 45 chapter arc. Punk Hazard is the arc that keeps on giving. People may act like Zoe has a ton to tell about the larger plot of One Piece, but that was mostly just exposition about Wano and the particulars of becoming Pirate King, which may sound impressive, but the individual plots and characters of each island have Punk Hazard to thank. Every arc after Punk Hazard builds off of elements established in Punk Hazard, without exception. Not only do we directly set up Dressrosa's antagonists and their operation, we begin establishing Law and Dofi's relationship while hinting at their respective pasts, while also formally turning Law into a long-term ally who's arguably the most prominent character in the whole story outside of the Straw Hat crew. Zoe shows the effects Caesar's weapons have in the New World, and Whole Cake Island brings up his dealings with Big Mom. And these dealings are literally foreshadowed by these giant melting skeletons and by the captive children. And let's not forget, our main villain Caesar continues to appear in most of these arcs. Even after he stops appearing, Wano still pays off the smiles and the gigantification experiments, wrapping up the conflict between the Alliance and Kaido. Punk Hazard also introduces Momo and Kinemon, who would play sizable roles in Zoe and Wano. Man, this look of shock on their faces when they realize Luffy wants to fight Kaido really hits different when you know their backstory, and just how terrifying Kaido is. Even Egghead, the arc that's currently ongoing, has so much to thank Punk Hazard for. It firmly establishes science as a core motif of the story. It introduces artificial devil fruits, Vegapunk's obsession with dragons, his hatred of war and weapons in contrast to Caesar, and it even establishes a baseline between a second-rate scientist funded by criminals and the brightest the world has to offer. So we completely understand just how powerful a first-rate scientist funded by the world's largest military power can be. And I think it's safe to say Punk Hazard will only become more relevant as the series goes on. It's a great setup arc in more ways than seems possible. I think One Piece fans and its theory culture specifically have stretched and twisted the word foreshadowing too much. A character having a god complex does not mean the story is foreshadowing other characters with god complexes 500 chapters later. That's just consistent theming. You can just as quickly say Wapol foreshadows Imu because they're both corrupt kings. But Virgo telling Law that he won't succeed because he knows nothing of Joker's past is actually foreshadowing. It tells us Doflamingo's background gives him some kind of unique advantage. An advantage we've already seen him flaunt when you go back and look. Punk Hazard is filled to the brim with these details, more so than any other arc I think. However, it's not without its downsides. The unfortunate thing about Punk Hazard is that it does have a good core theme, it's just that the very theme is executed better nearly every arc after it. A lot of ideas in my Daring and Mighty video build off of Punk Hazard, yet I only mentioned it in passing. The most interesting stuff happens after, but it did get the ball rolling. If the warlords Luffy fought before are the failures who have turned cynical, then the emperors are the winners who turned arrogant. The first handful of arcs after Fishman Island are about dethroning the ones who sit at the top of the pirate world, despite not being worthy of the title Pirate King. They're the ones who keep the world in a period of stagnation. We go from a king who can't progress because of conflicting priorities, to a delusional queen who can't see her own hypocrisy, to an emperor who's looking for a perfect death. But before all that, we start with a man lacking any real ambition. Caesar may want to prove he's better than Vegapunk, but he seems more eager to just live a carefree life under the protection of the aforementioned rulers. While he's a far more diligent fighter than someone like Caribou, he metaphorically fits the stereotype of an arrogant Logia who thinks they're invincible. Because who can touch him? The island is a secret and surely nobody is crazy enough to challenge him and his clients, right? Caesar adores the status quo, and if the Wano arc is partly about Luffy showing his values as a leader in contrast to the emperors, it's fitting that the main villain of the arc that first started building up to Wano was a man who's the worst leader you can imagine. A coward who doesn't care about his followers or friends, the type of person Luffy hates the most. And Caesar isn't the only poor leader in this arc. Virgo, like Caesar, is a man who only pretended to care about his followers for his own self-interest. And Virgo complements Caesar very well structurally. Punk Hazard feels relatively low stakes because there's essentially only 3 villains, and one of them is basically spawned him with a devil fruit. It mostly relies on the ticking time bomb of Smiley to add stakes. But another one of the villains is also a beast of a man who blows through opponents like Sanji and Smoker with ease. It helps keep the dramatic tension while representing Caesar's dependence on his backers. Caesar doesn't have the charisma to find his own strong subordinates, and he's not very strong himself. But as long as he stays in Doflamingo's good graces, he can borrow strong subordinates like Monet and Virgo. There's a good reason why I opened my Age of Daring and Mighty video with Law cutting Virgo and the gears. It's because this is the moment that Law and Luffy step beyond the point of no return, where they inevitably have to fight Kaido, a position Dofi wanted to avoid at all costs. One of my favorite details about Virgo and Dofi in this arc is how they tried to infantilize Law and talk down to him like a kid. It's Virgo-san to you. You must be traumatized by Virgo, Law. You must have a deep-seated fear of your childhood tormentor. They underestimate Law by calling him a kid and assume he'll never grow beyond being one, which is ironic considering Dofi's childhood trauma haunts him well into adulthood. But children grow up sooner or later, whether we want them to or not. After all, a new age is coming, and a determined young man is more likely to adapt than a king who's grown far too comfortable. In addition, Punk Hazard serves as what could be a great midsection for Smoker, Tashigi, Kinemon, and Momo. Wano is an isolated country that hates outsiders, and Kinemon putting his Bushido brand of honor aside to allow outsiders to help him is in miniature what the rest of Wano will soon learn. And Luffy eggs Momo on to do the first useful thing in his whole life. He gets him to fly for the first time, and Momo ends up helping Luffy out of a jam and into the final battle. It's Momo's first step to becoming a leader, and his big brother Luffy has always been pushing him to be one, even before he started doing it intentionally. Tashigi's whole character arc is clearly there to challenge Zoro's unwillingness to cut women. I know some of you don't buy it, but Zoro is incredibly reluctant to cut women. Maybe he's not technically sexist, but he's softer than he lets on. And it's a surprisingly consistent, if infrequent, element to his character. Tashigi having to finish an opponent that Zoro refuses to makes this part of Zoro's personality clear. Where you may have been able to deny it before, you can't anymore. Even if Tashigi never catches up to Zoro in terms of strength, Zoro defeating Tashigi or a woman at all would be character growth on his part. It's a very old yet often overlooked relationship that's bound to end in a proper duel sooner or later. And then there's everyone's favorite jobber, Smoker. Or at least he's my favorite jobber. Smoker was not a huge threat to Luffy like he was in the past. But Punk Hazard continues Smoker's arc in a way I really appreciate. Smoker hates the Marines and the government and the warlord system. They're all corrupt, and he doesn't mind disobeying orders to follow his own sense of justice. But at the end of the day, he's still a Marine. He works with an organization he disagrees with on so many levels. And in this arc, Smoker has to team up with some relatively chill pirates to defeat a corrupt and rotten Marine. And not just any Marine. A sleeper agent who sweeps injustice under the rug and works for a warlord. Virgo represents everything Smoker has come to hate about the Marines. He's the perfect opponent and probably the type of man Smoker hates the most. I know some people are sad Smoker wasn't as strong as Luffy or Law, and I get it. It's nice to see characters we like get a win. But on a technical level, it makes far more sense to have Smoker be weaker than Virgo. After all, if Smoker could beat Virgo on his own, he wouldn't need to get Law's heart back. He wouldn't need to choose between his pirate-hating pride and defeating Virgo. He decides that as much as he hates all pirates, and especially the warlords, this warlord is not nearly as bad as his superior officer. And in this moment, Smoker ignores labels. It doesn't matter who's a pirate or who's a marine, a warlord or a vice admiral. All that matters is Smoker saves his men, and Virgo gets his just desserts. But there is one more marine worth talking about here. Or former marine, I should say. Kuzan telling Smoker that you don't need to be a marine plays into both of their character arcs in obvious ways, as both of them are disillusioned with the government, and Smoker will likely leave the Marines or disobey them in some huge way. And Dofi saying Kuzan made up his mind about something teases his new goals. But there's this one line I completely forgot about, and it got to me emotionally when I reread this reunion. After Smoker accuses Kuzan of having ties to the underworld, Kuzan just replies, "I'm just me." Kuzan says this despite being allied with one of the worst people imaginable, and it makes me a bit sad. It's like Kuzan is trying to convince himself that he hasn't taken the wrong path. And with Garp telling him that wavering is a sign of weakness, Kuzan might just be in a spiral of bad decisions, and needs to become disillusioned all over again. Of course, this line could take on any number of meanings going forward. Garp is arguably too attached to the Marines as is. Maybe this line is Garp's way of coping with his own decisions and regrets. And it's so incredibly cool when these two face off later in the story. Particularly Kuzan's line, "You have a habit of raising enemies," gives me chills. Not just for the possible implications for Dragon and Kobe, but what that says about Garp. The most freedom-loving Marine who constantly smothers that love to fulfill his duty is too set in his ways to leave his post. He works for an organization he hates out of a feeling of necessity. But the people he influences end up hating the government the same way he does, but unlike him, they act on it. Maybe in part because they hate how it's treated him over the years. But regardless of all that, there's something melancholic about Kuizan's appearance in Punk Hazard. More so than was the previous times I read it. I think before I was just so distracted by how hype it was to see a former admiral outside of his uniform. But with the context we have now, I think the emotions of the scene are far more clear. Before I sign out, I want to praise Punk Hazard one last time because it was the last arc that had a couple certain somethings that the preceding arcs don't. And maybe the story will never have it again. If you asked me, I'd say the second half of the manga works better as an overall package. When I say second half, I really mean chapter 500 onward. Because the scope of the story has already been established and the arcs start flowing from one another more logically. The Sun and War saga works great to illustrate how weak Luffy is in the grand scale of things, and how he might get stronger. His solo adventure from Sabaody to Amazon Lily to Impel Down to Marineford all makes perfect logical sense and it works together super well. The same applies to everything from Punk Hazard to Wano, but the unfortunate consequence of this is that there's far less surprises now. Luffy and by extension we the readers usually know where we're going before we get there. And I'm not saying that kills the adventure or anything. We knew Wano would be based off Japan, we knew that Impel Down would be a prison, but we didn't know the particulars about what Luffy would find there. However, it feels less like a totally free adventure and more like a series of planned trips. There's a certain childlike wonder in just stumbling upon something exciting. Punk Hazard actually works really well as an introduction to the new world. We go in completely blind and our first sight is a sea of flames surrounded by lightning and fire, followed by a fight with a dragon and a bunch of centaurs. There's mysterious men in hazmat suits, and suddenly we learn half of the island is a completely different climate. And all the weird fantasy elements we saw have a scientific explanation. We meet a samurai literally introduced in pieces and it makes Law's abilities look terrifying. Even if the character writing isn't as mind-blowing as most other arcs, it's a very fun adventure to reread. Punk Hazard was also the last arc that didn't have a ginormous cast. And because of that, every Straw Hat did get a little something to do despite the not so long runtime. And this despite the fact that Smoker and Law have pivotal roles. For these reasons, I would consider Punk Hazard to be the last classic One Piece arc. It's a hard arc to find fault in, beyond just having less interesting antagonists at the expense of creating all this good setup. I love Caesar and Virgo, but they're no Doflamingo or Gecko Moria. I like Zoro vs. Monet for what it is, but it's no Mr. One or King fight. But if it makes several other story arcs more valuable while still being a fun read, then it itself has value. It's a shockingly strong example of an arc doing miles worth of legwork for the benefit of the next 400 chapters and beyond. Thank you for watching, like and sub if you want to see more, and in retrospect, Doflamingo coming to Punk Hazard alone seems incredibly reckless and stupid. I don't mean this as a critique of the story arc at all. I understand he was underestimating Law and Luffy and he wanted to save Baby 5 and Buffalo. But can you imagine if Dofi tracked down the Straw Hats or managed to meet them at Punk Hazard? He'd get his ass jumped by Law, Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, one of the 9 red scabbards, 6 other Straw Hats, a half-dead Smoker, and my girl Tashigi. And Kuzan would be getting comfortable watching the show.